Hello, everyone, and welcome to Worth Publishers' latest TLC Symposium, Stereotype Threat and Microagressions in the College Classroom, featuring Salsa Irvin and Cicely Medley. Salsa Irvin is an assistant professor of psychology in her 11th year at Tarrant County College. Hold on 1 second. Looks like we're having a sound issue. Okay, I believe we've cleared that up. So the title is Stereotype Threat and Microaggressions in the College Classroom, featuring Salsa Irvin and Cicely Medley. Dr. Irvin is an assistant professor of psychology at Tarrant County College in Fort Worth, Texas. He teaches general psychology and the psychology of adjustment, and also works as a licensed professional counselor specializing in Black African American clients. Her research interests include global mental health and mindfulness. Dr. Medley is an associate professor of psychology in her 8th year at Tarrant County College. She teaches psychology courses such as human sexuality and transition to college success. She also works as a licensed marriage and family therapist specializing in minority sexual identities. Her research interests include sexuality, cultural identification, and minority college student success. I hope that maybe when I put myself on mute that the squeaking will go away. I'm sorry, everybody. I don't really know where that's coming from, but I'm sure it will clear up. Before we get started, I just want to share a few things. If you have any questions, you can raise. Dr. Irvin, can you try putting your headphone on mute? I think that might be where the noise is coming from. Okay, so you can raise your hand if you have any questions, and you can also just type your question into the box at the bottom. If you don't see this box, you can hover over the top of your screen to display the toolbar and bring up this box. There will also be some polls during this presentation. You'll be able to answer the polls and submit them, and then when the poll closes, the overall results will be displayed, and then you can click this X to close it when you're done reviewing the results. Okay, I'm going to pass over control of the presentation to Drs. Irvin and Medley, and you will see their screen in just a second.
Greetings, colleagues. I think we're still getting a bit of feedback.
I wonder
but
if
we would like to. We do want to welcome you.
I think it might be related to you being logged in 2 different places. Maybe if Dr. Irvin logs out from her computer. Because the times I've heard this before is if the same person's logged in 2 places. I know it's not exactly the case, but maybe if you log out the other host, it will not make that noise anymore.
I think we've got it now.
Great.
I don't hear it anymore. Okay, well, again, greetings, colleagues, and thank you for joining us today. Dr. Medley and I offer a similar workshop to our colleagues in the behavioral health field, and that particular webinar or seminar is working with Black and African American clients in a behavioral health setting. And what we found is those have been very popular, but also very worthwhile seminars that we offer. The participants always come with questions, comments, and are definitely looking for solutions and working with their clients. What we decided was to transition this information to our experience with students in the classroom and offer for our colleagues some ideas and some solutions for working with students in the classroom. We work for Tarrant County College, South Campus, but we're part of a very large district. We have 6 campuses, and Dr. Medley's been here 8 years. I've been with the college 11 years, and over the years, we've seen a rise in tensions and disagreements and really sense of entitlement with students in general. However, we've seen more and more students who are presenting with complaints about things that are going on in the classroom with their professors. Because Dr. Medley and I both work closely with students, and because we also have personal close relationships with a lot of our colleagues, we see that a lot of these disagreements are really unintentional on the part of the faculty members. So we thought we'd address some of these things. We did get a series of questions submitted from some of you prior to the webinar, and what we've really tried to do is address a lot of those here in the presentation. But if we don't address the question that you had specifically, do feel free to ask the question. One of the questions that was particularly striking to us was one of our colleagues wrote, "I tend to stress there are social constraints and attitudes regarding class, race, religion, and sexual orientation. Our small college downplays these issues. The question, which do you feel is more productive, the truth or what we want to be the truth?" Here's our answer to that. The truth can be relative, as we know, based on where we are geographically and who our colleagues consist of, based on their backgrounds and their attitudes and their experiences. What we've started to do at Tarrant County College, which has been helpful and effective, even for those people who are not really interested in the truth in terms of having conversations about what we feel is the truth, is we're going toward data-driven discussions. We have on our campus, or in our district, a Diversity and Inclusion Council. We've done surveys. We as faculty and staff and students have participated in surveys, anonymous surveys of course, to get a pulse for how students feel about their treatment in terms of diversity and inclusion in the classroom. The numbers don't lie. We can debate about the numbers. We can try to understand and disaggregate the data to be more effective with our students. But for us, the truth has come in the form of numbers, what the students have said, what the staff have said, and what faculty have said in terms of how they feel about diversity and inclusion, which definitely relates to stereotype threats and microaggressions. So some of our objectives: we want to understand what stereotype threat is. We want to identify what some microaggressions in the classroom look like. And very specifically, we want to give tips to our colleagues how to be aware of, but also maybe how to avoid the stereotype threat phenomenon and microaggressions in the classroom.
So the description of the webinar specifies that the information we're sharing is related to minority students, but we want to make sure to acknowledge the fact that not only minority students are the ones with whom stereotype threat may apply, or even with whom microaggressions may apply. And so we wanted to specify that there were all of these other cultural status groups to which stereotype threat and microaggressions might apply on a regular basis, and particularly within the classroom setting. Especially, if you're thinking about us here at the community college, we have a wide range of students when it comes to age and life status, and we're finally beginning to address things like sexual orientation and gender identity, and even things like veteran status are becoming more important. So all of these are diversity social status groups that can be important to know more about when you're talking about the importance of language and social interactions and how it affects student success within the classroom. One of the questions we received was about how this information applies to instructors who are within minority social status groups. And we wanted to point out that much of this information is similar as far as the importance of knowing how these concepts apply to different groups and being aware and understanding one's biases, that regardless of whether you're in a majority social status group or a minority social status group, it is just as important across the board. Perhaps one of the benefits of being in a minority status group is that you have a different perspective that may actually help you to be in a better place to address some of these things, but we can't always assume that that's the case either. So again, I think everyone has some room to learn and some room where they can maybe increase their awareness about these concepts that we'll be discussing today.
We want to get a general idea from you all about some things that you've noticed in terms of the climate in higher education. So a couple of poll questions. The first one, have you noticed an increase in reports of racial tension on college campuses in general? One thing I do in the morning is look at InsideHigherEd.com. That's one of the first emails I checked just to get a pulse on what's going on in the larger world of higher education. And I've been really surprised that it seems like almost every week there's an issue of race and or gender, not just at community colleges, but at four-year colleges as well. So we have some yeses, it looks like a mix of yes and no. The second question, have you noticed an increase in racial tensions on your campus? So with students, with staff, or with faculty? As I mentioned, on our campus, there was a lot of anecdotal information about students making complaints in the classroom. It seems specifically in some of the history and government classes, and classes across the board, but we've heard more in those classes. So our data and inclusion team decided to create a survey to anonymously get feedback from students. So it looks like so fortunately there are a lot of no's in terms of seeing an increase in tensions in general and on specific campuses. Another question that we received prior to the webinar was what sorts of training is most effective for minimizing stereotype threat and microaggressions in college professors. That was one of the questions submitted to us. So another question that we have for you, is diversity and cultural competence training effective, generally speaking? So if you've attended diversity or cultural competency trainings on your campus, have they been effective? We asked this question of the participants in our behavioral health workshops, and for the most part, the response is, yes, we did get some information, but no, in terms of actually moving the needle and having a change on campus as it relates to understanding issues like stereotype threat and microaggression. So we ask participants and we ask our colleagues, why is it that you don't think these trainings or workshops are effective? Some of the reasons that have been given. So the question, are diversity and cultural competence trainings effective? Some of the reasons why the answer is no. Well, for one, depending on the climate of your campus, if you've had these type of workshops that have had a negative outcome, attending subsequent workshops could include good old Pavlovian classical conditioning. So a previously neutral topic was paired with undesirable conversations and disagreements that happened in the workshop, and subsequently going to the workshops becomes more of a chore. Another reason why the answer may be no is just some Freudian ego defense ideas. For example, it appears that if people do have previous biases about these types of workshops or training based on classical conditioning, then it's possible that participants will come in with denial. These problems don't really exist on our campus, or I'm not part of the problem. There could be some projection involved. A lot of conversations may include rationalization. The reason the students feel this way or respond to me the way that they do is because of X, Y, Z. Another reason why the answer is no in terms of diversity and cultural competence training being effective is implicit versus explicit attitudes. When we speak to our colleagues who have had disagreements with students, misunderstanding with students, what they may not realize, or what they generally do not realize, is their behaviors, their attitudes are more implicit. So their intention of not seeming biased come out behaviorally the opposite way, the way that it impacts the student. So what we try to do is make a big difference and highlight intent versus impact and help faculty understand, and our colleagues, it's not what you intended, but it's the impact that it had on students. One of the questions that we received from one of our colleagues prior to the seminar was a lot of conversations about stereotype threat and microaggressions are related to the deficit model as it relates to minority students. So this deficit model attributes students' lack of educational success to characteristics that are rooted in their culture and their communities. So the idea is, the discussion leads to, there are so many non-cognitive factors that have to be addressed with the student that stereotype and microaggressions really don't have a place in the conversation. Another reason why diversity, cultural competence trainings may not be effective is confirmation bias. So if a participant in a seminar about cultural competence believes it's not going to be helpful or believes it's going to be contention, and as they generally can be, there are some negative emotions that arise, that confirms the bias, this is going to be a poor training. So to define stereotype threat, we're using Claude Steele's definition based on his book, Whistling Vivaldi. So stereotype threat is defined as social premises, psychological threat that arises when one is in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one's group applies. Some of the questions that we received asked about the students' knowledge of stereotype threats and the students' knowledge of microaggressions, and if we, as faculty members, bring up those terms and definitions and explain them to the students, does that contribute then to a self-fulfilling prophecy? With stereotype threat, it is important that the individual who is under the stereotype threat acknowledges that the stereotype exists. So not all minority students acknowledge individually that the stereotype exists. That's one of the keys to the stereotype threat phenomenon, is acknowledgement. The second key is that now that they've acknowledged this threat, they are apprehensive about being the one to confirm the stereotype. So those two conditions as stereotype threat phenomenons are important. So as we said before, this conversation is about minority students in the classroom, but we fully acknowledge that this stereotype threat phenomenon applies to women in math and sciences, non-minority people with regards to appearing racist, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds compared to students from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, and other conditions exist for which stereotype threat may apply.
And so we have a graphic here that was actually taken from some research related to minorities interacting in medical or clinical types of environments and how stereotype threat might apply in some of those types of situations. And so you have two possible paths here, one where there is no stereotype threat, and another where there is some type of stereotype threat and how that might interfere with successful adherence to medical suggestions and things of that sort. And so I thought it might be useful to use this graphic and show parallels between how that same process might actually work within the classroom as well. And so starting out with the graphic at box A, you have this awareness of a negative stereotype or reputation by the student that carries that minority social status label. And so going into a particular situation, they will have certain types of uncertainty or vigilance related to those negative stereotypes or that reputation that they feel like they carry with them. And so on the one path, you have cues that come in when that minority student comes into your classroom, cues that disconfirm the relevance of stereotype in that particular situation for that particular student. So in that situation, you have a student who feels accepted for whatever reason, they feel validated, they feel like they are part of the in-group, and in that example, that student would not feel like stereotype threat applies, and they would have possibly a chance for successful experience within that classroom. The other option, of course, is a situation where you have a student that experiences some cues that confirm the relevance of stereotype threat for their situation. So the student might sense various types of tension between themselves and the instructor or themselves and other students. They may feel some sort of rejection from the professor or other students. They may feel like they are part of the out-group for one reason or another, or feel like there is othering going on, right? Some sort of social exclusion is happening. And so now here, stereotype threat applies. You have a student who has increased concern about confirming whatever that negative stereotype is about their social group. And so now we move into E. The student will engage in private or public processes to address that stereotype threat. And so they may have various physiological reactions to this. They may have behavioral reactions to try to address this feeling of stereotype threat. And so that can lead to things like F, avoidance, missing class, for example, avoiding interactions with the instructor, avoiding interactions with whomever they feel like that stereotype is coming from. Or G, there can be various types of miscommunications, both inside and outside of the classroom, emails, for example, or face-to-face conversations where many various misinterpretations may play out. Or even H, there can be low class participation by this student, which can lead to a lower likelihood of academic success for this student. all because of this perception that started out at the beginning of the semester or the beginning of class for the student, and that fear of playing into those negative stereotypes.
And moving on to a definition of microaggressions. Everyday insults, indignities, and demeaning messages sent to people of color by well-intentioned white people who are unaware of the hidden messages being sent to them. Dr. Medley and I are both unofficial mentors, and in Dr. Medley's case, student advisor to a student group on campus. We find ourselves each week in multiple conversations with students who have had some type of perceived insult or demeaning message from a faculty member. From our perspective as faculty members, and again, knowing our colleagues, we have to help the students understand how the interaction with the faculty member was not an intentional or demeaning exchange. To give you some examples, one African-American male student was discussing with me one of his classes. This particular class was a government class. He felt insulted, and he was explaining to me that the other African-American students in class felt insulted when the professor made jokes that the African-American student didn't understand. So knowing this particular professor and knowing this particular professor's sense of humor, I could understand why the African-American students, not just based on their ethnicity, but based on their age and based on their geographic backgrounds, did not understand the jokes this professor was telling. The professor did not mean to be insulting, did not mean to be demeaning, and did not recognize that some of the students did not pick up on the jokes. An example of a microaggression: the student felt insulted, the jokes had an impact on the student, the professor meant absolutely no harm in telling those jokes. Another example, students have reported to us feeling insulted or demeaned when they are asked to, well, one, if they voted for President Obama, and to justify why they voted for President Obama. Just a couple of examples of microaggressions that we've dealt with students pretty recently.
So researchers talk about different types of microaggressions that are possible. We wanted to make sure to give you some examples that you might be able to apply to your personal interactions with students and coworkers. So here you have three subsets of microaggressions. First, what are referred to as microassaults, which Sue says these are conscious and intentional types of aggressions that occur. Things like racial slurs or racial epithets that people will sometimes use that, again, are often intentional ways to other a person or to other a group. And so things like asking a Latino student to talk about illegal aliens in a class, specifically pointing that particular student out and making them feel like part of the out group. Or even a male teacher refusing to call on female students for political types of topics within a classroom would be an example of a microassault. Then you have what are referred to as micro-insults. These tend to be unintentional and more subconscious types of interactions, but they subtly convey rudeness and insensitivity and may demean a person's racial heritage or their identity in some way. And so things like telling an African-American or other minority student or an international student how articulate they are, for example, would be a micro-insult. And then lastly, we have what are referred to as micro-invalidations. These also tend to be unintentional and subconscious. these types of interactions are subtle ways to exclude, negate, or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a minority person. For example, if you ask an Asian student, now where were you born? That would be an example of a micro-invalidation. And diversity researchers like Sue, for example, often focus on the impact of micro-insults and micro-invalidations because they are often so unintentional and subconscious that it takes a little bit more work to identify these and to help people understand the impact that these interactions have on others, those who are in minority social status groups.
Another question we received prior to the webinar, and this is a statement and a question, so quote, some research I've read on stereotype threat suggests that covering this topic briefly can actually increase the threat for women and minorities. Is there a standard for how deep or prolonged an instructor should cover this topic in class, end quote. To address that question, from the perspective of the faculty member, I think it is more important to understand these phenomena versus talking to students in class about them. Dr. Medley and I, because we're at a community college, we're teaching 5 to 7 classes per semester. This semester we both have 7 classes. We work on a district syllabi, which is pretty concrete, but also very full, so it's important that we get all of the information about our subjects in, along with the campus announcements and other things that we are responsible for in the classroom. So we aren't necessarily advising that we bring these topics up in class because, yes, they can lead to negative outcomes. We are suggesting, however, that individually and collectively as faculty members, we recognize what's going on so we can alter our behavior, at least our perception of our students' behavior as necessary. From the student's perspective, a couple of things to take into consideration. One of them is learned helplessness. One of the questions that I ask students who come to me with some issue of a microaggression is, hey, what high school did you go to? Which gives me a really good indication for their learned helplessness. And what I mean by this is we hear a lot of stories from students that a particular subject or a particular type of teacher in high school was particularly distasteful to the student. The student learned in high school to not ask questions, to not engage in any type of debate or discourse, or to not voice their opinion about how they feel they're being treated. So as a result, when they get to us in higher education, they've already learned to be silent and to suffer in silence. From the perspective of the student, we also have the issue of victim entitlement. There is some research from Stanford University that indicates students who feel that they have suffered in life possess more of a sense of entitlement than do other students who perceive their life as more pleasant. Does that apply to all students who feel like they've been victimized in the past? Absolutely. But as it relates to microaggressions, that may help us to understand this is a student who feels like a victim, who has placed themselves in the victim category and feels entitled as a result of this category, which leads us to, if a student feels a sense of victimization coming into the college classroom, they could unknowingly find themselves in a self-fulfilling prophecy situation. Example, I think Professor X doesn't like me because I'm a minority. My behavior in class, I may show up late, I sit in the back row, I text instead of paying attention, my body language indicates that I'm not interested, Of course, these things are done unconsciously by the student. The professor responds in a similar behavior, unconsciously, of course, but not thinking about the student's minority status, but thinking about the student's behavior as a college student. The behavior of the professor then validates for the student, I knew this professor didn't like me because I am African American, for example. So just thinking about the student's perspective, the learned helplessness, the victim entitlement, and possibly self-fulfilling prophecies of the student help us understand some of the conditions and explanations of students as they are talking to us about microaggressions. Last year, 2013, Dr. Claude Steele's wife, Dorothy Steele, gave us a really great definition for student and student identity safety. Her information is really related more through K-12 education, but I think it's important for us to understand identity safety in the classroom for us. So what we want to move into now is where a lot of the questions that were submitted prior to the webinar, the area that they were in, are suggestions. So these are suggestions for creating identity safety in the classroom. And the suggestions that we're making, we're not suggesting that you make an announcement, hey, I'm creating an identity safe classroom. Rather, you do these things without explanation, and the actual behavior creates identity-safe classrooms. So some tips. For one, and this is one thing that Dr. Medley and I do, we make a blanket statement on our syllabus, but we also reinforce this verbally on the first day of class. For example, one thing that I say, and that's in my syllabus, this class is about the science of human thinking and human behavior. This class is about psychology. In this classroom, this is a college classroom, you will be exposed to ideas that challenge your personal belief systems. If you find something in the lecture or in my behavior that you have a question about or that you find offensive, it is your responsibility to come see me, and I am more than happy to discuss these things with you. So I set up the expectation that based on your background, based on your high school experience, based on your previous experience, based on your personal biases, there may be some disagreements, but it is your responsibility as an adult, a college student, to come talk to me about those things. So with that one, I haven't necessarily addressed any specific class of person or minority or any protected status, just a blanket statement. And I also add to the students jokingly, if something that I say or do is repeatedly offensive to you, it may be you. So they actually find that humorous, and it breaks the ice. So that's one thing I do on the first day of class. Another option for creating an identity-safe classroom that I found really effective is to provide the students with the chance to bring in alternative but also appropriate documentation about a topic that I'm presenting from a perspective that they are more comfortable with. And I tell them we only have 16 weeks for our 16-week classes to cover all of these chapters and all of this information. So there's no way that I can take into account all perspectives. So if you have a source that's relevant and it's appropriate, bring it in, and I can briefly incorporate this into the lecture. To give you an example of that, a couple of semesters ago, I had a Native American student in the psychology of adjustment class, and he made it very clear to me from day one that the information, the theories, and the textbook had nothing to do with him as a Native American, had nothing to do with the culture of being a Native American. So I asked him, do you have any books or articles or information that support psychology or behavioral health from a Native American perspective. And he gave me the name of an author. I Googled this author, found him on Amazon, and I was able to get several of this author's books for 1 penny, $3.99 shipping and handling. I brought these books to the class, passed them around. The student felt validated, felt included, and I never had to mention any information in the book. They were good, it was good information, by the way, but the student felt included and respected. Another tip to create an identity-safe classroom. On your downtime, whenever that may be, provide a bibliography in your syllabus with additional reading sources that cover your topic, your subject, from a perspective of race, perspective of gender, or maybe perspective of religion, if that's important in your subject. For me, I have a bibliography that includes the psychology as it relates to women, psychology of liberation, psychology in African Americans, psychology in Native Americans now with the recommendation from my Native American students, and psychology from the perspective of the Latino perspective. So providing a bibliography is a visual representation for the students, hey, this person is inclusive, even if I don't in class address those specific groups. Another tip for creating an identity-safe classroom, and this is more for creating an identity-safe campus, when we address that question of should we focus on the truth or what we want other people or what other people think is the truth, I think there are times, if this is the microaggressions and stereotype threat ideas are important to us, sometimes we have to take a courageous step and introduce these ideas to the campus. For example, maybe encouraging or offering a communication competence workshop for students. There is a student group here on campus that has regular discussions about how to bring up difficult conversations with their instructors in class and out of class. A lot of times students have not been taught how to start a conversation, how to ask questions without relying on the fact that they feel some type of emotion associated with the question or the professor. So a communication competence workshop that says, hey, this is how you ask questions, this is how you start the difficult conversations, and this is how you can feel included and have a voice when you speak in class and with your professor in his or her office. Another idea for creating an identity-safe classroom or an identity-safe campus is to allow opportunities for students to hear different perspectives on your particular subject area from diverse people in the community. For example, in our psychology department, in the spring semester, we offer what we call behavioral health seminars for the sociology students, the psychology students, but we open it to not only the campus but the community. We make a huge attempt to have speakers who represent psychology or behavioral health from an alternative or different perspective. For example, we've had a psychologist who speaks about curanderismo, which is a mental health perspective rooted in indigenous Latino culture. So we don't have to say, hey, we're inclusive. Here's the speaker, and this indicates to you as students that we are inclusive. So we really make a big effort to offer perspectives of a particular topic. Our topic is psychology, from diverse people in the community. Well, a question may be about budget with that. A lot of times we find colleagues who are willing to come and speak for 45 minutes on campus, and really all we're able to offer them is a glass of water and lunch maybe. So it may be a matter of finding colleagues in the community who are willing to do this for free if there are budgetary constraints. Another suggestion, this is something that Dr. Medley and I both do in our classrooms because we are pretty much tied to giving the information about psychology. We don't spend a lot of time on this, but what we will do is if there are announcements about student organizations or activities on campus that reflect diversity, we don't announce these in class, but we pass the flyers around. For example, hey, the Latin American Student Organization is having a bake sale. The African American Student Organization has a canned good collection going on. The Women in New Roles group is having a film festival. So you pass those flyers around, and I always tell the students, don't ask me any questions about this information. All of the information that you need is on the flyer. So making it a point to let the students know that they are included on your campus by just passing the flyers around that indicate that they are included. Another tip for creating, this is more identity-safe campuses, is to have courageous conversations about and frequent communication with colleagues who do not share your demographics. So if I get feedback from, let's say, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered students that they feel insulted or demeaned by something that I've said and it's repeated, I can ask Dr. Medley, who is the advisor for that group, hey, here's some things I'm saying in class. Let me check in with you to see how these things are inappropriate. That also includes if there are repeated infractions, I will call them, by faculty members who are colleagues, maybe having a conversation with a colleague. Hey, I didn't know if you knew this. I just wanted to point out to you that when you use this particular terminology in class or you reference a specific group in class, the students feel insulted or demeaned. I'm sure you didn't know this, but let's just have a quick conversation about it. So those are a few tips.
And so just to add a few more to that, to give you some practical ways to implement some of this information you've heard today. An additional way that you can create that identity-safe classroom is to solicit anonymous feedback from students. Allow them a way to communicate with you that doesn't have as much pressure as perhaps the face-to-face communication often does. And so there are a variety of creative ways that you might be able to do that. Have a box outside your office door where students can drop in cards, for example, or have something at the back of the classroom where after each class session people can drop in cards that are anonymous. Or there may be other ways that you can come up with as well. The point is, again, allowing that anonymous communication from the student to you. One of the things that Dr. Irvin mentioned earlier that is a tip as well is understanding the relationship between intent and impact when it comes to some of these difficult conversations and some of these social interactions that we have, that there is an important difference between intent and impact. The person experiences the impact of your behaviors or your verbalizations. Only you as the initiator know what that actual intent was. But what is going to affect the response from that person is the impact that they feel of that verbalization or that interaction. And so that's what we have to focus on is what is the impact of those and how can we change the impact of these interactions that we have, regardless of whether I had a positive intent or not. It is also often important to emphasize the, as opposed to focusing on things like intelligence or talent or genius or how smart students are, it can be important to focus more so on things like effort and motivation in the classroom. Oftentimes, things like talent and genius and intelligence are correlated with race differences and socioeconomic status differences, and it can cause more of those stereotype threat types of situations to arise. And so to help eliminate some of those differences, we can focus more on effort and motivation, those students who are working hard, those students who are consistent, for example, and that can help to increase the success of students in our classrooms all the way around. A big piece of this conversation is related to language. It's very important to reflect on the language that you might use to describe various groups of students or types of students in your class, whether these be race-based labels or even things like gender or age groups. We often get comfortable using certain types of labels that can actually be quite offensive. And so if you take the time to reflect on things that you may say frequently and the impact that they may have on people within your classroom, that can be helpful. Along those same lines are things like statements such as, "I'm colorblind." And oftentimes people, again, when they use that phrase, their intent is positive, but being colorblind and saying that you are colorblind is actually quite offensive. It's talking about how you are invalidating the cultural experience of a person. If you were saying that everyone is the same, I don't see color, that often means you are overlooking a very important part of a person's cultural identity. And so that the language that you are using in interacting with people is often a reflection of your underlying values and your underlying beliefs and assumptions. And those can be really important to reflect upon and at times to maybe make some changes to as you know more and understand more about how those things are impacting the students and even the coworkers that you are interacting with. And Dr. Irvin mentioned this as well a minute ago, not just creating these identity-safe classrooms, but identity-safe campuses overall. And so we received a couple of chat questions during the presentation that I wanted to address. And so one of those questions was that people who need diversity training the most are often the ones who don't attend, and so how do you address that? And I definitely think that creating that identity-safe campus is very important. Creating that environment of acceptance and inclusivity is very important. And it really does take a very focused approach. It's one of the things that we are attempting to do here at the Tarrant County College District right now. The administration all the way across the board has to accept these ideas and accept these values of inclusivity and really be committed to implementing these things. Having and creating that environment of respect must be something that's implemented across the board. And so that might include requiring people to go to various types of trainings that are related to diversity. And this also may answer another one of the chat questions that came through that says some employees aren't open to ideas of diversity that go beyond race, that they have a very narrow view of what diversity is. So this idea of diversity education is very important, and I like to think of it in that way as opposed to saying diversity training, but more so about diversity education or education on inclusivity. Right now at Tarrant County College, we have a requirement for professional development hours that can focus on pedagogy or other things like diversity, for example. And so within that, it might be useful for some schools to require, or even some departments to require, that faculty or staff have some portion of that professional development specifically focused on diversity, which we do have here, and it's part of our new employee orientation. And so there sometimes are policies that you may have to put into place as you move towards creating that culture of inclusivity. Often people aren't going to embrace that on their own, which is unfortunate. But once you start to bring in people who embrace inclusivity and everyone sees that from the administration all the way across that inclusivity and respect is what's expected, you are on your way to creating that environment across your campus and possibly across the district. And so we've covered our content for this presentation, and we are definitely willing to answer any questions with the few minutes that we have left.
If anybody has any questions, please type them into the chat box and we will address them. Also, earlier in the presentation, you spoke about a student who felt the teacher didn't like him because of his race and then behaved inappropriately. What should the professor do given that the student's behavior is inappropriate for success?
I think you're speaking to the example that I gave. The student felt offended because he and some of the other African-American students in the classroom didn't understand the jokes of the professor. They didn't feel included. So as a result, they felt demeaned. That is one of the situations where I think it's important for students to understand communication competence. In that situation, I think it is the student's responsibility to speak to the professor. Hey, Professor so-and-so, just a quick question or a quick observation. Some of the students in your class feel separated or not included in some of the conversations you're having. I didn't know if that was something that's being done intentionally or you didn't recognize that we felt excluded. Can you help me understand? So there is, and I think it's really important that we are teaching our students communication competence because it is the student's responsibility to speak up. On the part of the professor, this is one of those situations where I mentioned that Dr. Medley and I know this professor pretty well, and we are pretty confident that this person did not mean any insult. So my recommendation for the student was just what I said. Bring this up with the professor in his or her office and find a resolution that way.
Thank you. The attendee clarified that the example that she was referring to was when the teacher didn't say the teacher didn't say anything, but the student just thought he wasn't liked.
I think that was part of the self-fulfilling prophecy. That was an example, and the same recommendation would hold true. As the student, or for students, I think it's our responsibility on our campuses to teach this communication competence. If you feel demeaned, if you feel victimized, you're not in high school anymore, it's now part of your responsibility to speak up. And if there is a situation that needs to be elevated, we have a protocol for how that happens. So we want to continue to encourage students to have a voice, to speak to their professors when there is some sort of misunderstanding or disagreement.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have is, do you have tips for how to work with presidents and vice presidents who resist even having the conversation?
Dr. Medley spoke about that briefly, and for us, we're in a district. We're part of a 6-campus district, so we have the presidents on our campuses, but we also have vice chancellors and a chancellor. For us, the conversations about diversity and inclusion are non-negotiable as it relates to what we're doing on our campuses. We have decided as a campus, as a district rather, that based on the data, these conversations are necessary and we will have them. So for us, having the presidents or administration involved is not an issue because there's not a choice in the matter.
And I'll add to that, as part of our diversity and inclusion initiative, we started out by creating councils on each campus that could respond to the individual campus climates and go through the individual campus data, as there often are some interesting demographical differences on each campus. And so in doing that, though, part of the training that those council members have gone through was presented to our district board. And so members of our board are actually also going to be going through the training. And members of our executive team, the different campus presidents, will also be going through the training. And I think that's what is important, is including the administration in part of that educational process if you want that change to be across the board and if you want to create that inclusive environment across the board.
Thank you. I have a few more questions for you, but before that, for those of you who have to leave exactly at 2 o'clock Eastern, I wanted to just direct your attention back here. You should be, I have to make myself the presenter. On the screen, you're going to see a 5-digit number, letter combination. This is the number you will need if you're going to request APA continuing education credits. This is the number that you will be asked for when you fill out the questionnaire that I will be sending out after the presentation. It's E as in Irvin, M as in Medley, F as in February, 10. So EMF10, that's the number that we're looking for when you fill out your questionnaire and quiz for the continuing education credits. Okay. So if you do have to take off, thank you for coming, and we're so glad that you came. If you're able to stick around, we do have a few more questions for Professors Irvin and Medley. Okay, so going back to your answer from this 2 questions ago, is why is it the sole responsibility of the student? It would seem that students coming in from high school need to be met halfway. How do we do that?
It's a good question, and in some of our student identity safety tips, we want to make sure the student has a voice, recognizes his or her responsibility, but we want to also make sure the campus is providing those opportunities for the students to learn how to ask questions, how to have debate, and how to have discourse. So we mentioned, even if it's an individual effort, having a communication competence workshop for the students. That can be a departmental effort, it can be a campus effort, it can be something that you partner with your student development services to offer a workshop. Dr. Medley and I both have offered a wide range of workshops based on problematic situations that we've seen with students that are not race or ethnicity related, just with students in general. So is the onus on the student? Yes. Do we also have a responsibility, because that's what we do, is educate? Absolutely. So we can do that as individuals with workshops, in our departments with workshops, roundtable discussions, brown bag lunches, partnering with student development services. Those are all ideas.
Thank you. The next question I have is, can you say more about the effects of stereotype threat on academic performance and retention?
Well, I'll say the graphic that we put up earlier in the presentation spoke to that a little bit. There's a wide range of research out there that talks about how stereotype threat and even things like microaggressions can have a negative impact on student success in the classroom, that students may feel less engaged. If they don't feel validated, they may be less engaged. It's going to be much harder to retain them from one semester to the next, that there's a lower likelihood for their success in the classroom if they don't feel accepted, if they don't become engaged, if they don't feel validated. So I think there's plenty of research out there that supports the fact that there's a connection between these experiences of things like stereotype threat and student success or retention issues. And much of it talks about the negative part of that relationship, of how things like stereotype that can have a negative impact on retention and things of that sort. And so I guess I would want to know if there was a specific aspect of that the participant was interested in knowing about, since we did speak to that a little bit already.
And I can also add, I'm on the Student Success Committee for the district, and just last week we were discussing student retention, student attrition, and coming up with a different way to poll the student about why they're leaving. So when we find that they're withdrawing, is there some type of way that we can ask them to honestly give us feedback about what's going on with them in terms of why they're leaving us? We have tried that, and generally we don't get very much response. The students just don't respond about why they're leaving. So many reasons why the students are not being retained. Could that be the microaggression stereotype threat? Absolutely. If we're creating these identity-safe classrooms and campuses, the idea is that we're going to see less attrition based on these ideas if these are the issues the students have, the microaggressions or the stereotype threat.
Great, thank you. The next question I have is a question about language. You mentioned that there is a language that we use to describe students in your class. There is, sorry, not a language. There is language that we use to describe students in your class that can be offensive. Can you give some examples of the specific labels or descriptors that could be offensive?
Yes, from some conversations that we've had with students, some male professors refer to women as gals or girls, and may make specific gender-related comments as it relates to their own gender role identity. So women should do this, or girls or gals would be one example. Another example that I've had conversations with students about is using what can be considered demeaning terms for students. For example, calling a student sweetie or honey from the professors, and this would be, for example, a female to a female, professor to student, not anything having to do with sexual harassment or that category, but just an endearing term as it's meant by the professor, but demeaning as it impacts the student. Again, honey or sweetie would be some examples of that language.
And even some of the things that we've heard in the media recently are sometimes applied to students just in casual conversations between faculty or staff, where we maybe believe that there are no students who are listening, but you never really know whether students hear some of these conversations. And so even labels like thugs or hoodlums or the slackers in my class, even those things, I think, send a particular message about how the instructor perceives those types of students in the class setting.
Great, thank you. Next question is how do you assess effectiveness of education on microaggressions and stereotype threat? I am interested in making my university a regional training center for developing cultural competence in health professionals and educators.
Can you repeat the first part of that question?
Yeah, sorry. I realized as I was reading it, you probably didn't need all of that information. How do you assess effectiveness of education on microaggressions and stereotype threat?
The education for colleagues? How do you assess?
I guess I assumed students.
For the example of creating or offering workshops or brown bag discussions for the students on campus, that may be a simple task of evaluating the effectiveness, an anonymous evaluation of the effectiveness of the information. For staff and for faculty, I would have to say the same thing, an honest, anonymous evaluation of the content and a space in this evaluation for give us feedback on how this workshop or presentation or training could be more effective.
And one of the things we're doing here with our diversity and inclusion initiatives is we already have data that is now informing our strategic plan for each campus. And so we will then be reassessing students and faculty and staff at some point once we've implemented the main parts of our strategic plan, and that will help us assess partly the effectiveness of this implementation. Are people's views more open, more inclusive? Are they at least different than the way that they started out? Are people a bit more accepting? Are there as many biases being expressed as there were before with our initial data? So we sort of have this baseline, and so I think part of that process is just continual reassessment through things like focus groups or surveys and questionnaires or evaluations, so that you have as much information as possible to go on to give you some indication about whether what you're doing is effective or not.
Thank you. This question, I feel like part of it was answered earlier, but then part of it I think could be expanded on. Do you personally teach about racism in your Psych 101 class at all, or about stereotype threat? I feel like leaving it out would be unfortunate, but that when I teach about it, the results could make it harder for people of color in my classes.
This is Dr. Irvin. For me, I do not teach about race and or stereotype threat specifically. We are in an area that geographically there are conversations that have happened in the past in the classroom that have been pretty explosive as it relates to race. For example, some terms and terminology to describe African American or Black students that, again, with intent and impact, the students did not mean any negative intent. It's just the categories or terminologies that they've always used in their communities and their families to describe Black or African American individuals that did not go over well. So unless we are talking about race as it relates to intelligence in some of the research or some other areas that are specific to our district curriculum, I personally don't focus on race, ethnicity, or stereotype threat in the classroom. What I do instead is make those bibliographies available to students. Here are some things that you can read about as it relates to the subject of psychology that you may have a question about. So for me specifically, I do not address stereotype threat or race in my classes.
And this is Dr. Medley. I do in each of my classes, just in different ways. Because I teach human sexuality, I talk quite a bit about sexual identity and sexual orientation differences in that class. In my lifespan class, I do talk a little bit about racial and ethnic differences and things like discrimination as it relates to other topics, as it relates to differences in human development or cultural practices when it comes to parenting, for example. So I try to weave those things throughout just because I think it's important conversations to have without specifically saying this is a conversation about race. And even in my intro psych class, usually I will define stereotype threat and talk a little bit about it. In my online intro psych class, one of their assignments is actually to complete the implicit association test related to race. and they have to do a response for that for a graded assignment, and I use that as an opportunity to talk a little bit about social biases and how those impact people's interactions. And so I try to find opportunities to bring up these topics in a way that is educational, that's hopefully not blaming or accusatory, but is just really trying to increase people's awareness about the topic.
Thank you. The next question, is, what about people who are invisible minorities? For example, bicultural. Is it harder on them?
At the beginning of the presentation, we tried to specify that as we're discussing microaggressions and stereotype threat, we are inclusive of not just race and ethnicity, but some of the other classes as well. But to address people who are multi-ethnic, I think that is a question that can be answered individually, because there are some multi-ethnic students who self-identify with one ethnicity over the other. And of course, there are some that are relating to both or however many of their ethnicities. So can it be harder? That would be an individual question for the student who is multi-ethnic or multi-race. There is a book that came out recently, and I can't think of the name of the author, but it's 15 vignettes about students who are multi-race and their experience on college campuses. And this is something I read last week, and I apologize, I don't remember the name of the author, but it's a recent publication, 15 or so students who give their anecdotal experiences with being multi-race or multi-ethnic.
And I think there are certain situations that may be a bit more difficult for students with certain types of hidden identities. I think, for example, there are students who have various types of disabilities, like cognitive or mental disabilities that are sometimes hidden, or even something like sexual orientation that can be hidden at times. And so I think, again, it's an individual thing, like Dr. Irvin said. It really just depends on that student and where they are with that identity, and what types of experiences they have. Because with those hidden identities, you're more likely perhaps to have things like offensive statements or interactions because the person isn't censoring as much because they don't recognize that hidden identity. So it very much so is an individual thing.
Thank you. And one of our attendees actually was familiar with the book you were referencing, and it is called Mixed.
Can you repeat that, Andrea?
One of our attendees was familiar with the book that you were referencing, and the title of the book is Mixed.
Okay, that's it. That's it. That's easy to remember. For some reason I couldn't, but thank you for that.
Okay, there's one more question. There were a few questions that were very similar to questions that were already asked, so hopefully you feel that you got answers to your questions. The last question I have is, feeling that you are in the out group can be all in their head and not as much to do with what anyone in the class has created. So what do you suggest a professor could do to work with perception of students who take offense easily or take offense without perceived cause?
That question definitely relates to, and we talked about victim entitlement and self-fulfilling prophecy and learned helplessness. I think the answer to the question lies in, does the student actually voice his or her concern about feeling demeaned or insulted? If they don't ever voice it, there's really no way, there's no feedback for the professor to understand the impact his or her language or behavior had on the student. So what we have to understand is, has the student actually voiced an opinion? And in that scenario, of course, speaking with the instructor, speaking with the professor, and the professor using a tone a voice, and making sure that the student feels included and feels heard in the conversation. So the thing about stereotype threat and microaggressions, and this is the big key, is that a lot of times we don't know that the student feels insulted or demeaned if they don't say anything. So our suggestions about creating identity-safe classrooms, we're being proactive in recognizing that students do come to us with learned helplessness and self-fulfilling prophecies and victim entitlement. We're not going to be able to address all of their concerns, but if we proactively put some measures in place, the idea is that we'll have a reduction in the stereotype threat and microaggressions in our classrooms.
And I'll add a piece to that that goes back to a few of the comments that were made about the difference between intent and impact. That, you know, again, oftentimes people's intent is very positive and it's very well-meaning, but the impact can be very offensive or invalidating for a person. And I think just with that, that statement that it's all in that person's head, even that implies a sense of invalidation, that you're totally discounting that person's experience. Again, it really goes back to it's about how that person experiences things. You know, many people on the outside may say, well, there was nothing offensive that happened there, but the person that experiences that offensive act, it's their perception that's important. And that perception may be based on various life experiences that other people on the outside don't know about. And so I think it's a bit dangerous to invalidate another person's experience in that way. Even though we don't agree with it, I think there's a way to try to validate that as much as possible and say, yes, you have that experience, and I'm sorry that I didn't realize that this was going on or that this was happening. I don't necessarily agree with the way you're seeing things, but let's try to find a way that we can address this that works for everyone.
Okay, great. Well, that concludes all of the questions that I had. Thank you so much to Drs. Medley and Irvin for this presentation. Thanks to the attendees. Thank you for sticking around. I hope that you will attend some more webinars in the future. You can always keep up to date with our recordings and any upcoming webinars by going to this link that you should see on your screen, psych.facultylounge.worthpublishers.com. It will also be an email I send, so don't feel that you have to write that down. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @WorthPsychTLC. So those are some places where you can keep in touch about future webinars. So thank you so much, Dr. Irvin. Thank you so much, Dr. Medley.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody have a great day. Bye.